The dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light, each one a tiny, silent witness. Leo held his breath, making himself small behind a row of forgotten filing cabinets in the municipal archive room. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and decay, a smell he now associated with fear. He could hear the footsteps, slow and deliberate, on the other side of the metal shelves. They were expensive shoes, the kind that made a soft, confident whisper on the polished linoleum, not a scuff or a shuffle. It was the sound of a man who believed he owned every room he walked into, Mr. Finch's sound. Leo pressed his cheek against the cool, painted metal, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He had not meant to see, he had not meant to hear. He had only been looking for a place to be invisible for a little while. A place where the noise of the world, a world he could hear but his mother no longer could, would finally fade. He'd found this forgotten room weeks ago, a sanctuary of silence. But today, the silence was broken. Mr. Finch had not been alone. There was another man, a man with a nervous, twitching face, who had taken a thick manila envelope and left without a word. It was what came after that made Leo's blood run cold. Mr. Finch, alone now, had spoken into his phone. His voice, usually so smooth and charitable, was a blade of ice. "The asset is secured. Phase 2 is contingent on the boy's continued compliance. If he shows any reluctance, we accelerate the protocol." The mother was a test run, a successful one. The words meant nothing and everything. The mother, a test run. Leo's breath hitched, a tiny, betraying sound. The footsteps stopped. The soft, confident whispering of the expensive shoes fell silent. Leo squeezed his eyes shut. He imagined the man standing perfectly still, his head tilted like a hawk listening for a field mouse. The archives were a maze of towering shelves, a forest of forgotten facts and figures. But the room was not that large. A predator, if he was patient, could flush his prey out. Leo could feel the man's presence, an oppressive weight in the quiet room. He had to move. He had to get out. But his feet were rooted to the floor, fused there by a terror so pure it felt like ice water in his veins. This is how a child disappears, not with a shout, but with a whisper of footsteps on a polished floor, a whisper of words not meant to be heard. They disappear in the quiet spaces, the overlooked corners where no one thinks to look until it is far too late. Leo risked a glance through a narrow gap between two stacks of archived tax records. He saw a flash of a tailored gray suit, a glint of a gold watch. Mr. Finch was moving again, methodically checking the aisles, his patience a palpable threat. Leo knew he had one chance. There was a service door at the far end of the room, usually propped open for ventilation. It led to an alley. If he could make it there, if he could just be faster, for once in his life, be faster than the fear. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the dusty air scraping his lungs. He counted to 3, a silent prayer to a God he wasn't sure was listening, and then he ran. His sneakers made a desperate squeaking sound on the floor, a sound of pure panic. He heard a sharp intake of breath behind him, the whisper of the shoes turning into the hard, driving slap of a pursuit. The door seemed a mile away. The alley outside was a sliver of brilliant, terrifying daylight. He pushed himself harder, his small legs pumping, his lungs burning. He didn't look back. He couldn't. To look back was to be caught. He burst through the door and into the alley, the sudden sunlight blinding him. He stumbled, catching himself on a brick wall, scraping his palms. He didn't stop. He ran into the street, a ghost of a boy, propelled by a secret that was too heavy for him to carry alone. He ran toward the one sound he trusted in the world, the low, rumbling thunder of motorcycles, the sound of home. Leo's world had shrunk to the size of a notepad. For the past 6 months since the sickness, his life was a series of scribbled questions and answers, exchanged with his mother, Sarah. "Are you hungry?" he'd write, and she would nod, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I love you," she'd write back, her handwriting a little shaky, the loop of the Y a little sadder than it used to be. The silence in their small house was an entity of its own, a heavy blanket that smothered laughter and arguments alike. Before, there had been music. Sarah loved music, the kind with loud guitars and roaring vocals that would shake the windows. She and his father, Preacher, the president of the Iron Serpents Motorcycle Club, would dance in the kitchen while they cooked, their laughter the soundtrack to Leo's life. Then came the headaches, the dizziness. The doctors at the county hospital were baffled. They ran tests, scanned her brain, and found nothing. "An idiopathic neurological event," one of them had said, a fancy way of saying they had no idea. The hearing went last, fading over the course of a week, until one morning she woke up and the world was muted forever. Preacher had changed. The easy grin he always wore was gone, replaced by a permanent furrow in his brow. He spent his days researching experimental treatments and his nights staring at the ceiling, the weight of his wife's silence pressing down on him. He still ran the club, but the joy was gone. He was a leader going through the motions, his heart trapped in the quiet house with Sarah. And in that heavy silence, Leo became invisible. His parents, lost in their own separate worlds of grief and confusion, didn't see him fading. They didn't see him stop drawing, stop asking questions they couldn't answer. He was a good boy, a quiet boy, and in their distraction they mistook his withdrawal for peace. It was into this void that Mr. Alistair Finch had stepped. Finch was a pillar of the community, his name on a wing of the very hospital that had failed Sarah. He was a pharmaceutical executive, a philanthropist who sponsored the town's Little League team and donated to every charity bake sale. When he heard about Sarah's condition, he'd shown up at their door with a casserole and a check for $1,000. He'd called it a neighborly gesture. He took a special interest in Leo. "The boy needs an outlet," Finch had told Preacher, his voice oozing with synthetic empathy. "Let me mentor him. I can show him a world beyond all this." Preacher, desperate and exhausted, had agreed. So Leo started spending afternoons at Finch's sterile modern home, or at his gleaming corporate office. Finch would talk to him about ambition, about legacy, about how the strong had a duty to guide the weak. It all sounded noble, but it felt wrong. Finch's kindness was like a coat that was too heavy, too warm. It was suffocating. Leo never felt at ease. He saw things. The way Finch's smile never touched his eyes. The way he spoke to his staff with a quiet contempt that was more chilling than a shout. He saw vials with complex chemical labels in a locked cabinet in Finch's study. Vials the man claimed were for his botanical hobbies. Leo didn't have the words for the feeling, but he knew it was the same feeling he got when he saw a snake coiled in the grass, perfectly still, waiting. He tried to tell his father once. "Mr. Finch is weird," he'd said, the word wholly inadequate for the cold dread he felt. Preacher had just sighed, rubbing his temples. "Leo, the man is trying to help. Be grateful." Grateful. The word felt like a stone in his stomach. He was grateful for his father, for his mother, for the rumbling family of the Iron Serpents. But he was not grateful for Mr. Finch. He was afraid of him. And now that fear had a voice. The mother was a test run. The words echoed in his mind, chasing him down the street, each syllable a footstep gaining on him. He wasn't just running from a man in a gray suit. He was running from a truth so monstrous it threatened to swallow his whole world. The Iron Serpents clubhouse was not a place of chaos. It was a sanctuary of order. To an outsider, it might look rough, a nondescript cinder block building on the industrial edge of town, surrounded by a dozen gleaming chrome and steel machines. But inside, it operated on a code as rigid and unbreakable as the engine blocks they rebuilt. The smell of worn leather, cleaning solvent, and fresh coffee hung in the air. Tools were hung on pegboards in perfect, disciplined rows. Every man had a function, a purpose. Preacher was their leader, the moral compass. But the man who was the club's quiet, steady center was Saint. A former Marine Force recon sniper, Saint said little, but he saw everything. He was the club's sergeant-at-arms, the enforcer of their code, and his gaze missed nothing. He had a past etched in the fine lines around his eyes, a history that had taught him the high cost of not paying attention. He was cleaning his rifle at a long workbench when Leo burst through the door, gasping for breath, his face pale and streaked with tears. The other members present, Cutter and Bear, looked up, their easy conversation ceasing instantly. Saint didn't startle. He simply put down his cleaning cloth, his movements economical and precise, and turned his full attention to the boy. "Leo," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble. "Breathe." Leo couldn't speak. The words were trapped behind a wall of panic. He just shook his head, his eyes wide with a terror that was ancient and profound. Saint knelt, bringing himself down to the boy's level. He didn't touch him, didn't crowd him. He just waited, a pillar of calm in the boy's storm. "You're safe here," Saint said. It wasn't a question or a platitude. It was a statement of fact. This building, these men, they were a fortress. "Tell me what happened." Leo's words came out in a torrent, a jumble of terror and confusion. "Mr. Finch, the archive room," he said, "a test run. Mom was a test run." The words hung in the air, nonsensical and horrifying. Bear, a man whose massive frame belied his gentle nature, looked at Cutter, the club's paralegal, whose mind was as sharp as a prosecuting attorney's. Cutter's expression was already hardening, the gears of his analytical brain beginning to turn. Saint's face remained impassive, but a flicker of something cold and dangerous moved in the depths of his eyes. He had spent years of his life hunting men like Finch, men who hid their poison behind masks of civility. He recognized the shape of the monster, even from a child's fragmented description. He placed a heavy, steadying hand on Leo's shoulder. "What else, Leo? Did you hear anything else? Any single word?" Leo squeezed his eyes shut, trying to pull the memory from the fog of fear. "A name," he whispered. "He was on the phone. He said a name, a word. Atravan dichloride." Cutter's head snapped up. "Say that again." "Atravan dichloride," Leo repeated, the strange words feeling alien on his tongue. Cutter was already moving toward his laptop on a nearby table. He wasn't a chemist, but he had spent years navigating the labyrinth of legal and corporate documents, and he knew how to follow a trail. The men of the Iron Serpents were more than just bikers. They were a collective of skills honed in war zones, boardrooms, and back alleys. Bear was a master logistician who could get anything anywhere. Cutter could dissect a holding company's financials in an afternoon. And Saint knew how to watch, how to wait, and how to act with absolute unwavering resolve. They existed to protect their own. And Leo, the son of their president, the child of a woman they all loved like a sister, was their own. The unspoken code was now activated. The boy was a threat to the entire brotherhood. They would not act with rage or brute force. That was for amateurs. They would move with the quiet, methodical precision of a predator, and they would not stop until the threat was neutralized, and the truth, no matter how ugly, was brought into the light. The quiet of the clubhouse was no longer calm. It was charged, the air humming with a singular, unified purpose. The annual Town Founders' Day picnic was the jewel in Alistair Finch's philanthropic crown. He funded the whole affair, the bouncy castle, the hot dogs, the fireworks display. It was a masterclass in public relations, cementing his image as the town's benevolent patriarch. It was also the perfect hunting ground. Finch moved through the crowd with an easy, practiced charm, shaking hands, kissing babies, his gaze sweeping, always cataloging, always assessing. He saw Leo standing near the lemonade stand, looking small and lost. The boy's father was 100 feet away, pushing Sarah's wheelchair through the thick grass, his attention entirely on his wife. The boy was isolated, perfect. Finch had a vested interest in Leo. The boy was the control group. Sarah had been the test. Her sudden, inexplicable deafness was a data point, a proof of concept for a much larger, more lucrative application of his company's newest, most discreet chemical compound, an untraceable agent that could induce specific neurological damage. The potential military and corporate applications were staggering, but it was a volatile substance, and he needed to monitor for any unforeseen side effects in a genetically related subject. He needed to be close to the boy, to observe him, to ensure the contamination in their well water was manifesting as predicted. His mentorship was a clinical observation disguised as charity. He started walking toward Leo, his smile perfectly calibrated, when he saw the boy's eyes widen in recognition and terror. Then the boy did something unexpected. He ran, not toward his father, but away, toward the edge of the park, toward the industrial zone. Finch's smile tightened. A complication. He made a mental note to accelerate the protocol. At the other end of the park, a man sat on a bench, sketching in a worn notebook. To most, he was just another piece of the town's scenery, a homeless man they called Elias, known for his quiet presence and the startling intelligence in his eyes. But Elias had once been Dr. Elias Vance, a brilliant toxicologist whose career had been destroyed when he'd tried to blow the whistle on a powerful pharmaceutical company for falsifying trial data. That company was now owned by a subsidiary of Finch's corporation. Elias had lost everything: his license, his family, his reputation. He now lived on the margins, watching the town that had cast him out. He watched Finch, a man he knew to be a wolf in sheep's clothing, and he watched the people Finch interacted with. He had noticed Sarah, Preacher's sudden illness with a professional's alarm. He'd seen the slight tremor in her hands, the faint web-like rash that sometimes appeared on her neck before she lost her hearing. They were symptoms he'd seen once before in the lab animals from that falsified study. Now he saw Leo, the boy who was always in Finch's orbit. As Leo ran past, Elias noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the back of the boy's arm, just below the sleeve of his t-shirt, was the same faint web-like rash. It was a ghost, a whisper of a symptom, but to a man who had lost everything for seeing what others would not, it was a smoking gun. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. It wasn't a random illness. It was a targeted event. Sarah wasn't a tragedy. She was an experiment, and her son was the next phase. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline, the ghost of the physician he once was, rising from the ashes. He had a choice. He could remain a ghost, a silent observer on a park bench. Or he could act. He could try to warn them, but who would listen to a disgraced homeless doctor? He looked across the park and saw the one group of people in town who operated outside the tidy, respectable channels of power, the Iron Serpents. They were feared by many, but Elias had seen them differently. He'd seen them organize a toy drive at Christmas. He'd seen them escort a fallen soldier's funeral procession. They had their own laws, their own code, and he suspected that code included protecting a child. As Leo disappeared from the park, Elias stood up, closed his notebook, and began walking. He was no longer drifting. He had a destination. He was going to the clubhouse. The boy's panicked flight and the doctor's quiet resolve were two sides of the same coin, two separate streams of truth now flowing towards the same destination. about to merge into a flood that would tear Alistair Finch's carefully constructed world apart. The front door of Alistair Finch's corporate headquarters was all glass and brushed steel, designed to project an image of transparency and strength. Saint and Bear walked through it as if they owned the place. They were not wearing their club vests, their cuts. They were dressed in plain, dark work clothes, but their presence was no less intimidating. They carried themselves with an unnerving stillness, a coiled potential energy that made the receptionist's polished smile falter. "We have a meeting with Mr. Finch," Saint said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was not a request. "I'm sorry, he's not expecting anyone," she stammered, her fingers hovering over the intercom button. Bear leaned forward slightly, placing his huge, calloused hands on the marble countertop. He didn't say a word. He just smiled, a gentle, almost sad smile that was somehow more menacing than any threat. The receptionist buzzed them through. Finch's office was on the top floor, a corner suite with panoramic views of the town he considered his personal fiefdom. He was surprised to see them, but his composure was flawless. He rose from behind his massive mahogany desk, his hand outstretched, his face a mask of pleasant inquiry. "Gentlemen, to what do I owe the pleasure?" he asked, his voice as smooth as polished granite. "We're here about the boy," Saint said, ignoring the offered hand. He and Bear remained standing, two unmovable objects in Finch's pristine, ordered world. "Leo, he's upset." Finch's expression shifted to one of deep paternal concern. "Oh dear, is he all right? The poor child has been through so much. I consider it my civic duty to look after him and his mother." "He said some things," Saint continued, his eyes locked on Finch, watching for the slightest crack in the facade. "Confused things. He mentioned a name. Atravan dichloride." For a single, infinitesimal moment, the mask slipped. It was a flicker in the eyes, a tightening of the jaw, a barely perceptible tensing of the muscles in his neck. It lasted less than a second, but to a man trained to read a target from a mile away, it was as loud as a gunshot. Finch recovered instantly, letting out a soft, dismissive chuckle. "That's a chemical solvent we use for cleaning industrial machinery. We decommissioned its use months ago due to environmental concerns. The boy must have seen an old canister in a storage facility. His imagination is running away with him, which is understandable given the trauma he's experienced. He was good. He was very, very good. He wove truth and lies together seamlessly. The chemical was real. The reason was plausible. The concern for Leo was perfectly feigned, but he had already revealed himself." Bear took a slow step forward, his sheer size seeming to shrink the cavernous office. "He's a good kid," Bear said, his voice a low rumble. "Doesn't imagine things. He sees things." The air in the room grew thick, heavy with unspoken accusations. This was not a physical confrontation. It was a battle of wills, a psychological probe. The bikers weren't there to make threats. They were there to gather intelligence, to confirm a suspicion. They were letting the predator know he was being watched. "I assure you," Finch said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "my only interest is in the boy's welfare. If you'll excuse me, I have a great deal of work to do." "We'll be seeing you," Saint said. It was a promise. As they turned and walked out, Finch remained standing behind his desk. His hands were trembling slightly. He had underestimated them. He had mistaken them for simple thugs, not the disciplined, observant force they so clearly were. He had thought the boy was a manageable risk. He now realized the boy was a trigger, and he had just pulled it. He walked to the window and looked down at the town below. He had always seen it as a chessboard, its people his pawns. But two new pieces had just appeared on the board, pieces that moved by their own rules. And for the first time, in a very long time, Alistair Finch felt a sliver of fear. The clubhouse had transformed into a war room. Maps of the industrial district were spread across a long table alongside Cutter's laptop, which hummed with a constant stream of data. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and concentration. Elias, the homeless doctor, sat at the table, a cup of black coffee cradled in his hands. He looked out of place in his frayed coat, yet he commanded the room's absolute attention. He had become their chief intelligence officer. Atravan dichloride is a smokescreen, Elias explained, pointing a shaky finger at a chemical diagram he'd drawn on a napkin. It's a common industrial solvent, just like Finch said, but it's also a key precursor agent. On its own, it's relatively harmless, but when combined with a specific proprietary catalyst, it becomes something else entirely. He looked up, his eyes burning with the intensity of a man finally being heard after years of being ignored. It becomes a neurotoxin, specifically an ototoxin. It targets the cochlear nerve. It's subtle, cumulative, and designed to mimic the symptoms of a rare, naturally occurring neurological disorder. It's the perfect weapon. No trace, no evidence, just a medical file full of question marks. Preacher, who had been listening in grim silence, slammed his fist on the table. "My wife," he growled, his voice thick with a mixture of rage and guilt. "He tested it on my wife, through the well water, and I let him near my son." "You didn't know," Saint said, his voice a steadying anchor. "Now we do. Cutter, what have you got?" Cutter leaned back from his laptop, rubbing his tired eyes. "Finch is a ghost. His corporation, Omnigen, is a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. But ghosts leave footprints. Omnigen has a patent for a water purification agent. The patent is classified for national security reasons, but I found a leaked abstract. It describes a compound that neutralizes biological agents. The chemical structure in the abstract, it matches the one Elias drew. The pieces were assembling themselves into a picture of unimaginable evil. While this was happening, Preacher made a call. His contact was a detective named Miller, a man who owed him a favor from years ago. Miller was a good cop, but he was skeptical. A homeless doctor's theory and a biker gang's suspicions were not probable cause. "I can't get a warrant based on this, Preach," Miller said over the phone. "It's a conspiracy theory. I need something concrete." The breakthrough came from the one source they had tried so hard to shield. Leo, feeling safe for the first time in months, surrounded by the quiet strength of the Brotherhood, began to draw. He wasn't drawing motorcycles or superheroes. He was drawing what he'd seen in Finch's office. He drew the locked cabinet. He drew the vials inside it, meticulously recreating the complex warning labels he had seen. He drew a diagram he had seen on Finch's computer screen, a map of the town's water table, with a bright red circle drawn around his own neighborhood. He slid the drawings across the table. Elias picked up the drawing of the vial. His breath caught in his throat. The label Leo had drawn was not for Atravan dichloride. It was for the catalyst, the proprietary classified catalyst. The boy had drawn the missing piece of the puzzle. "This is it," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "This is the proof." Preacher took a photo of the drawings and sent it to Detective Miller. He then called him back. "You wanted something concrete, Miller? My son is a witness. He saw the weapon. Now, are you going to do your job, or do we handle this ourselves?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. The unspoken implication was clear. The iron serpents had their own form of justice, and it was far swifter and more final than the legal system. "I'm on my way," Miller said, his voice grim. "Keep your people on a leash." The gears of systemic justice, so often rusted shut by money and influence, were beginning to grind into motion. They were being forced to turn by the courage of a small boy, the knowledge of a forgotten doctor, and the unyielding resolve of a brotherhood bound by loyalty and a code that put the protection of the innocent above all else. The raid on Omnigen headquarters and Finch's private residence happened at dawn. It was a quiet, professional operation led by a grim-faced Detective Miller who now understood the stakes. The Iron Serpents were not present. They had given their word they would stand down, and their word was iron. But they were not idle. They had established a perimeter a mile out, their bikes parked at key intersections, their presence a silent, watchful promise. They were there to ensure that no one interfered, that no one slipped through the net. The news broke on the local station at 6 a.m., and by noon it was a national story. Billionaire philanthropist Alistair Finch arrested in connection with environmental poisoning scandal. The headlines were sensational, but they only scratched the surface of the horror. The town reeled in disbelief. This was the man who had built their new library, who sponsored their kids' sports teams. The initial reaction from the community was denial, then confusion, then a slow dawning anger. People who had once crossed the street to avoid the bikers now looked at them with a newfound respect. The image of the Iron Serpents standing guard on the edge of town became a symbol of the story. The town's self-proclaimed savior was a monster, and its supposed outlaws were its protectors. The community began to polarize. Finch's high-priced legal team released a statement calling the allegations a baseless fantasy concocted by a disgruntled former employee and a group of violent criminals. Supporters, many of whom were on Finch's payroll or had benefited from his donations, held small rallies, chanting his praises. They were met by a growing number of counter-protesters, families from the affected neighborhood, environmental activists, and ordinary citizens horrified by the betrayal. The Iron Serpents remained outside the fray, their mission singular: protect the family. They set up a rotating watch at Preacher's house. Their bikes lined the street, a silent, gleaming wall of steel and leather. Sarah would sit on the porch, a notepad in her lap, and watch them. She couldn't hear the comforting rumble of their engines, but she could feel the vibration in the wooden planks of the porch. It was the feeling of safety, a feeling she had not known for months. Leo stayed inside, but he would watch from his window. He saw his neighbors, people who used to hurry past his house, now stop and offer the bikers coffee and donuts. He saw the local sheriff's car drive by, the officer inside giving a slow, deliberate nod of respect to the men on watch. The world outside was loud and chaotic, but inside the protective cordon of the Brotherhood, there was a profound sense of peace. The public reckoning was not just about Finch. It was about the town itself. It was a moral inventory. Who do we trust? Who do we believe? Do we believe the man in the expensive suit with the easy smile or the quiet boy with the haunted eyes? Do we fear the men with tattoos and leather vests, or the man who poisoned a community while accepting its applause? Slowly, painfully, the town began to choose. The media frenzy intensified. News vans camped out near the courthouse. Experts debated the science on cable news. But the emotional heart of the story remained in that small, quiet house, guarded by a brotherhood that had closed ranks around one of their own, demonstrating to the world that true strength is not measured by wealth or influence, but by who you are willing to protect when the whole world is falling apart. The trial of Alistair Finch was the biggest legal event in the state's history. The courtroom was packed every day, a theater for a drama of profound moral consequence. Finch sat at the defense table, impeccably dressed, his expression a carefully crafted mask of wronged innocence. His lawyers were slick, expensive, and experts at sowing doubt. They painted Elias as a vindictive, mentally unstable drug addict. They portrayed the Iron Serpents as a violent gang pressuring a traumatized child into telling lies. It was a classic strategy: attack the messengers, discredit the witnesses, and create enough reasonable doubt for an acquittal. Their strategy began to crumble the day Dr. Elias Vance took the stand. Clean-shaven, wearing a borrowed suit that was a size too big, he was no longer the ghost from the park bench. He was a scientist. He spoke with a quiet, unshakable authority, explaining the complex toxicology in terms a layman could understand. He laid out the chemical pathway from the precursor to the toxin, presenting years of his own research which had been suppressed by Finch's company. He was not just a witness. He was the living embodiment of the truth Finch had tried to bury. The defense attorney's aggressive cross-examination couldn't touch him. "Isn't it true, Dr. Vance, that you were fired for professional misconduct and lost your medical license?" the lawyer sneered. "I was fired for refusing to falsify data that showed this very compound was dangerously toxic," Elias replied calmly, his eyes on the jury. "I lost my license for telling the truth, a truth Mr. Finch has spent millions to conceal." You could feel the tide turn in the courtroom. But the most powerful testimony came from the smallest witness. Leo walked to the stand, his hand held by his father. He looked tiny and vulnerable in the large witness box. The prosecutor was gentle, his voice soft. He asked Leo to describe Mr. Finch's office. Instead of just talking, Leo took out his sketchbook, which the judge had allowed as evidence. He showed the jury his drawings, the cabinet, the vials, the map on the computer screen. His memory was photographic, his rendering precise. Then the prosecutor asked the question that mattered most. "Leo, what did you hear Mr. Finch say on the phone?" Leo looked at the jury, his gaze steady, his voice clear and unwavering. He said, "The mother was a test run, a successful one." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. It was the first time the motive had been stated so plainly, so brutally. It was no longer about environmental contamination. It was about a deliberate, clinical, human experiment. Sarah sat in the front row, watching a sign language interpreter convey the proceedings. As Leo spoke those words, she closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of validation. Her suffering had not been a random tragedy. It had a name and a face, and it was sitting 50 feet away. On the final day, Finch, against his lawyer's advice, chose to take the stand. He was arrogant, convinced his charm could still win the day. It was a fatal miscalculation. Under the prosecutor's relentless questioning, his composure finally shattered. His polished lies unraveled, revealing the cold, narcissistic void at his core. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. The verdict was guilty. Guilty on all counts: aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, illegal disposal of hazardous materials, and a dozen lesser charges. As the verdict was read, Finch's face went slack with disbelief. The mask was gone. All that was left was a small, pathetic man, stripped of his power and prestige. Justice had been delivered. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a moral one. It was a declaration that a child's testimony could bring down a titan, that a forgotten man's knowledge could reshape the truth, and that a brotherhood's loyalty was more powerful than a corporation's influence. As they left the courthouse, Preacher put his arm around Leo. The iron serpents formed a protective circle around them, shielding them from the swarm of cameras, and escorted them home. The conviction was not an ending. It was a beginning. The shock waves from the Finch trial radiated outward, forcing changes that would redefine the community for decades. The first and most immediate consequence was the environmental cleanup. A federal agency, armed with the evidence from the trial, designated the entire neighborhood a priority site. Teams in hazardous material suits became a common sight, drilling new wells, replacing pipes, and testing the soil. It was a long, arduous process, but it was a physical manifestation of healing, a cleansing of the poison that had seeped into the ground. Omnigen was dismantled, its assets seized to pay for the cleanup, and a massive victims' compensation fund. The case triggered a wave of legislative action. The Leo and Sarah Preacher Act was passed by the state legislature, a landmark bill that closed legal loopholes, allowing corporations to self-report environmental data and established stringent new criminal penalties for the falsification of safety trials. It created a whistleblower protection fund, ensuring that what happened to Elias Vance would never happen again. The hospital, deeply embarrassed by its association with Finch, conducted a full audit of its donor relationships. New policies were put in place to create a firewall between philanthropy and institutional policy, ensuring that no single donor could ever again wield such insidious influence. The town itself was transformed. The old, easy trust in wealth and power was shattered, replaced by a healthier, more vigilant skepticism. Town hall meetings, once sparsely attended, were now packed with engaged citizens demanding transparency and accountability. But the most profound changes were the personal ones. Dr. Elias Vance was offered his medical license back by a state board that issued a formal apology. He politely declined a prestigious research position at the state university and instead accepted a job as the head of the local free clinic, the very place that had offered him shelter in his darkest days. He had found his calling not in a gleaming laboratory, but in serving the community he now called home. The Iron Serpents found their public image irrevocably altered. They were no longer seen as a menace, but as guardians. The community that had once feared them now embraced them. Their annual toy drive saw a tenfold increase in donations. When they rode through town, people waved. They had not sought this acceptance, but they accepted it with quiet dignity. Their greatest legacy, however, was a silent one. Sarah, determined to rebuild her world, began taking American Sign Language classes at the community college. To her astonishment, the entire club decided to learn with her. Every Tuesday night, the clubhouse, once filled with the roar of engines and loud music, was now filled with the quiet, graceful motion of hands. Bear, with his massive fingers, struggled but persevered. Cutter picked it up with analytical speed. Saint, the man of few words, discovered he was remarkably eloquent with his hands. It became their new language, a way to include Sarah in every joke, every debate, every story. It was a testament to their bond, a commitment that went deeper than words. The silence in Sarah and Preacher's home was no longer heavy and oppressive. It was filled with a new kind of communication, a visual language of love and loyalty. It was the sound of a family reforging itself, stronger and more resilient than before. The seasons turned. The yellow tape and hazardous material signs in the neighborhood came down, replaced by newly seeded lawns and the sound of children playing. The world, slowly but surely, was healing. On a warm Saturday afternoon, a year after the trial, the Iron Serpents clubhouse was humming with a gentle, celebratory energy. It was a welcome home party for Sarah, who had just returned from a specialized clinic where she had been fitted with state-of-the-art cochlear implants. The technology, funded by the Victims' Compensation Fund, was a miracle of modern science. It would never be the same as before, the doctors had warned. The sound would be different, electronic and strange, but it would be sound. Preacher stood beside her, his hand on the small of her back, as Elias, now a trusted friend, activated the device for the first time. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut. There was a faint hiss, then a series of beeps. Then she heard a voice. It was distorted, robotic, but it was unmistakably her husband's. "Can you hear me, babe?" Preacher asked, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah's eyes flew open, tears streaming down her face. She nodded, unable to speak. She reached up and touched his face, as if confirming he was real. Then she looked around the room at the faces of the brotherhood, all of them watching, their expressions a mixture of hope and trepidation. She could hear the murmur of their voices, the clink of a glass, the soft shuffle of feet. It was a symphony. Leo stood beside her, holding her hand. He had been quiet all day, watching everything with his old, perceptive eyes. He leaned in close. "I love you, Mom," he said, his voice clear and true. Hearing her son's voice, a sound she thought she had lost forever, was the moment everything truly came back. She knelt and pulled him into a fierce hug, burying her face in his hair, the sound of his breathing the most beautiful music she had ever heard. Later that evening, the party moved outside. A bonfire crackled, sending sparks up into the twilight sky. The bikes were parked in a neat row, their chrome gleaming in the firelight. Sarah sat between Preacher and Leo, listening. She was still signing, her hands moving in concert with her words, the new and old languages merging seamlessly. She was not just hearing again. She was whole again. Leo was at a small picnic table, a sketch pad, open in front of him. He was no longer the haunted, invisible boy from the archives. He was confident, at peace, surrounded by a family of his own choosing. He finished his drawing and brought it to his mother. It was a picture of their new world. In the center was the clubhouse, warm light spilling from its windows. A line of motorcycles stood guard out front. On the porch, a woman was signing "I love you" to a man with a beard. Standing beside them, a man in a doctor's coat smiled. And in the foreground, a young boy was sketching in a notebook, looking not over his shoulder in fear, but forward into a future that was safe and bright. Sarah looked at the drawing, then at her son, then at the circle of loyal, loving faces around the fire. The world was still a dangerous place, but she knew with an unshakable certainty that they were safe. They were home. The final images of the drawing, tacked to the clubhouse wall, a child's simple, perfect rendering of a promise made and a promise kept.